In this video, I'm going to share on a question that I get a lot as a teacher, which is, how do I study for chemistry? Now, this question is something that I'm very reluctant to answer. Reason being, as a teacher, you would notice that different students have different styles for studying, different methods that work for them. So there's no one single method that would work for all students. So I'm very scared when students were to ask me, "Sure, how do I study for chemistry?" But recently, a few students came up to me and they tweaked the question a little, which is, "Sure, how do you study for chemistry?" All right, so that got me thinking of myself as a student. How did I study for chemistry? And indeed, I am able to identify a certain routine that had worked for me over the years. So in this video, I'm going to share with you that routine and certain tips that can help you study chemistry maybe more effectively. So when I reviewed my own revision for chemistry, there seems to be two key stages or two key phases in my revision. In phase one, there are two steps. The first step is that I will make notes, all right? And then the second step, I would memorize the notes that I've written and attempt to recall what I've memorized. So this is stage number one. In the second stage, I will start with step number two. So I will try to recall whatever that I've memorized for that chapter before I attempt or before I do the worksheets or questions that are related to that chapter. All right, and in stage number two, you see that there is a reverse arrow. All right, meaning that for this phase, steps number 2 and 3, I will repeat them over and over again, maybe on a different day. So in a different day, I will again recall whatever that I've memorized, and then I'll redo the same set of questions to see whether I've already mastered the concepts and be able to apply them accurately and quickly to a question. So in the next part, I'm going to elaborate a bit more on each step. So the 3 steps that I've identified: making notes, memorize and recall, and then practice and apply. So the first step is that I make notes. I know at this point in time, many of you all will say that, "Sure, I do the same. I also make notes, high five." But before you get overly happy, I want to point out a few key differences between what I mean by I make notes and your version of making notes. All right, I'm sure many of you all would have made notes in preparation for a test and end up not doing well for the test. Okay, this is a very common occurrence. So please take note of what I'm going to share next. Now, the key differences between my version of making notes and maybe what you have been doing is this. You have to take note that making notes should not be the main revision. Meaning, if making notes is the only thing that you're doing to prepare for the exam, you are setting yourself up to fail. Okay. Secondly, making notes should not occur just before the exam, the day before, or maybe a few days before. All right, because making notes is time consuming, and if you start late, you will end up doing only that as a form of revision for your exam, and you will not be able to do well. All right, so take note. If you want to make notes, you should start early, maybe after a chapter is being taught, or very, very early in your revision. Okay, making notes should not occur just before the exam. All right, a few other tips. When I'm making notes, I will refer to reliable sources. For example, the notes that I've written down in lessons or from the textbook. Okay, and an important point is this, that the only reason why I make notes, all right, is to ensure that the key points are in a concise and structured manner to help me memorize better. Okay, I repeat again. The only reason why I invest the time into making notes is to make sure that the information that I need to memorize is organized in a way that helps me memorize more easily. Okay, having said that, if a teacher were to provide a summary notes to me that has all the key points in a format that I can easily memorize, then I wouldn't waste the time to make my own notes. All right, because I would just take that set of notes, which is already organized and structured, and I'll use it to memorize straight away. In step number 2, after I've memorized all the key concepts, then I will attempt to recall them. Okay, so what I'll do is I'll take out a piece of blank paper, a piece of rough paper, and then for example, if I've just memorized the types of oxides under acids and bases, so this is what I'll do. I'll just take out a blank piece of paper, I'll write oxides. There are two types of oxides. We can have metal oxides and non-metal oxides. Okay, I've memorized that metal oxides are mostly basic. All right, there are three of them that are amphoteric. And the three of them that are amphoteric are my Z oxides, so zinc oxide, aluminum oxide, and lead oxide. Okay, non-metal oxides are mostly acidic. Okay, there are three of them that are neutral, and the three neutral oxides are my CO, NO, and H2O. Okay, the other thing that I learned about oxides is that acidic oxides, they behave like acids, so they will actually react with bases. Basic oxides, they behave like bases, so they will react with acids. Okay, neutral oxides, as the name suggests, they are neutral, so they do not react with acids and bases. All right, so for amphoteric oxides, we are left with the last permutation, which is this, that they react with both acids and bases. Okay, so this is what I will do in attempting to recall whatever that I've memorized. So a few things to take note over here is that when I'm trying to recall, I wouldn't bother to write it out neatly or even in full sentences. Okay, so I will just write it out in a very crude manner to test whether I'm able to retrieve whatever that I've memorized from memory. Now, how this works requires an understanding of how knowledge is being saved in our brain. All right, our brain contains cells called neurons. Okay, so I have brain cells called neurons. Okay, and when you learn something, okay, when you learn something new, what is happening is that your brain cells are establishing connections between the neurons, and these connections are called synapses. Okay, so when you learn something for the first time, the connection that you build, the synapses are very thin, are very weak. All right, but when you try to recall it a second time, what are you doing is that you're strengthening these synapses. All right, and if you try to recall that knowledge or that new knowledge multiple times, what happens is that the synapses become very strong, and it becomes very easy for you to recall that information. Okay, so when you memorize and when you try to recall it time and time again, what you're doing is that you're building thicker or stronger connections between the neurons, which will allow you to recall certain concepts or relations more easily. So some of y'all have mentioned in the exams, you just cannot remember, cannot recall whatever they've memorized. The main reason for that is that your synapses are very, very weak. So you haven't tried to recall it enough. So that's why you're finding it very, very hard. So as mentioned in step 2, what I will do is that I'll memorize the key concepts, explanations or equations, and then I'll attempt to recall them, okay, many times. Okay, usually when I'm doing this, step number 2, I'll do it one chapter at a time. All right, because it will become too overwhelming if you were to memorize all the chapters in a single day. All right, if memorizing one chapter at a time is still a little overwhelming for you, you might want to try one section at a time. Okay. Now, the main complaint that I get from students all the time is that, sure, I really cannot memorize. Now, unfortunately, without memorizing the key concepts, content, explanations, there's really no way for you to be able to do well in a pen and paper assessment. All right, so I'm going to share a few tips on how I memorize, and do try them out to see whether they will help in your memorizing of the content. Tip number 1 is that when I'm memorizing, I will block out one or more senses. Okay, for example, I may wear noise cancelling headphones or earplugs to block out my sense of hearing. And somehow that allows me to focus better, and it makes me easier to memorize the thing that I need to memorize. Alternatively, sometimes I do close my eyes, all right, to block out my sense of sight. All right, or I can do both. So I will put on earplugs, I will close my eyes. Of course, after reading the content, you may be wondering, how do you read and the content when your eyes are closed? Which is, after reading the content, I'll close my eyes, and then I'll try to memorize whatever that I've just read. Now, the second tip is to use mnemonics. This is a very, very powerful tool that helps me to memorize large chunks of information. One example would be this. For example, in the syllabus, we learn the differences between mixtures and compounds. Okay, there are 4 key differences between the properties of mixtures and compounds, and how I remember them is by this mnemonic spec. Okay, so the word spec. The word spec will allow me to recall the 4 headers for the differences between mixtures and compounds, and the 4 headers are separation, properties, energy change, and composition. Okay, so once I can recall the 4 headers, I have a structure to work with, which allows me to recall the content in each header more easily. For example, I can recall that mixtures can be separated by physical methods, compounds can only be separated by chemical methods. Right, in a mixture, the mixture will retain the properties of the components in the mixtures, whereas a compound would have new or unique properties that are different from the elements that make up the compound. Okay, energy change, there is little or no energy change when we form a mixture. There's usually energy given out or taken in when a compound is formed. All right, and lastly, composition. Mixtures have no fixed composition, whereas in compounds there is a fixed, the elements are combined in a fixed ratio. Okay, so in this illustration, we see that how we can use mnemonic in order to remember huge chunks of information. Another example is in the chapter of redox chemistry, where we learn about oxidation and reduction. There are 4 definitions for oxidation and reduction, and how can I remember them is by the mnemonic SHU. Okay, what does SHU stand for? SHU stands for oxidation state, hydrogen, oxygen, and electron. So we can define oxidation and reduction based on 4 different definitions. And here is how you can recall. Oxidation occurs when there's an increase in oxidation state of an atom in a substance, when a substance loses hydrogen, when a substance gains oxygen, when a substance loses electrons. The reverse is true for reduction. Reduction occurs when the oxidation state of an atom decreases in a substance, when a substance gains hydrogen, when a substance loses oxygen, and when a substance gains electrons. So once again, over here you can see how a mnemonic can serve as a scaffold for you to link many information together. Now, tip number 3 for memorizing information is to connect any new information to existing knowledge. Now, this again works by establishing connections between your neurons. All right. So, if you want to learn something entirely from scratch, you would have to establish an entirely new synapse, all right, which is much harder than if, for example, you already have a connection, right, between a few neurons, and you just need to establish a new one to another neuron. All right. So by by connecting whatever that you're trying to memorize to something that you already know, all right, it allows you, it's much easier than if you were to try to memorize it as a standalone piece of information. Okay, how this works, for example, if I'm trying to memorize the properties of ionic and covalent compounds, okay, remember we learned certain properties that are associated with ionic compounds and then covalent compounds, and we have to memorize the properties. If you are One way to help you memorize it more easily is to recall an ionic compound that you are already familiar with in your daily life. All right, same thing to remember the properties of a covalent substance. One way is to link it to some covalent substance that you are already familiar with. For example, ionic compound, the model ionic compound would be sodium chloride, which is your kitchen salt or your table salt. All right, covalent compound would be for example, your oxygen gas. Okay, something that we breathe in every day. Okay, so if we think about ionic compounds being sodium chloride, what can you recall about sodium chloride? Sodium chloride, they are solids at room temperature. Right? For something to be a solid at room temperature, it must have a high melting point. Okay? Can table salt dissolve in water? Obviously, that's how you get your salty water or your salty soup. All right, so ionic compounds are generally soluble in water, and when something is soluble in water, they are usually insoluble in organic solvents. Okay, for covalent compounds, oxygen, we know that it's a gas. For something to be a gas at room temperature, it must have a low boiling point and melting point. Okay, and then covalent compounds are the opposite to ionic, so they have opposite properties as well. So they are insoluble in water. In fact, in the collection of gases that we have learned in chapter 1, we learned that oxygen is insoluble in water. Therefore, we can use displacement of water in order to collect the gas. Insoluble in water. And when something is insoluble in water, they are usually soluble in organic solvents. Okay? So by recalling a model ionic or covalent compound that we already know something about, it allows us to connect the properties to them, which will allow us to memorize more easily. Another way of how connecting knowledge is very powerful and helps you to remember is this. Once we can recall that ionic compounds have high melting point, all right, for something to have high melting point, they must have strong attraction between the particles. Okay, so that will allow you to link to the fact that ionic compounds have strong electrostatic forces of attraction between ions. Okay, so this kind of attraction happens in what we call a giant ionic lattice structure. Okay, for something to have low boiling point, there must be weak attraction between the particles. So in covalent compounds with simple molecular structures, they have weak intermolecular forces between the oxygen molecules. Okay, and this kind of structure is called your simple molecular structure. Now we have looked at steps 1 and 2. Step 1 being making notes. Step 2 being memorizing and recalling what I've memorized. Now if you fulfill steps 1 and 2 and you go for an exam, it's still unlikely that you will do very well for the exam. Okay, because at this point in time, you have just memorized the things very, very well, but you have yet to learn how to apply it to a question. All right, so that is where step number 3 comes in. After I've memorized and able to recall all the information that is needed, that is when I attempt the worksheets, my 10-year series, and not just to attempt them, but to do and redo them. Okay, if you take a look at the types of practices, usually I will start with topical practices. So I will, after memorizing for a chapter, I will try to apply whatever I've memorized for that chapter. All right, until I've covered every single chapter and I am confident in applying whatever that I've memorized for that chapter to questions related to the chapter. That's when I will practice my test and exam papers. Okay, a key word over here is redo. Okay, many students would do a worksheet for one time and think that, oh, I've revised sufficiently. Now, the golden rule is this. If I give you a question from the worksheet or a similar question from the worksheet and you're still not able to do it or get the question entirely correct, then you haven't really done the worksheet. Right? So it's very important for you to redo the worksheet until if you see the same question or similar question, you are confident that you can do it and get full marks for that question. Only then you have really done the worksheet. Now, in the course of doing the topical practices and the exam papers, there will definitely be questions that I cannot do. All right, that's because of certain concepts that I still cannot recall very, very well, or certain approaches that I still do not know how to apply. Okay, so that's when I will come up with a second set of notes. All right, where it includes the concepts that I have difficulty recalling, as well as the questions that I have difficulty answering, or the questions that I tend to make mistakes in. All right, so this second set of notes will be something that I look at just before the exam. All right, so I will not be looking at the initial set of notes anymore because at this point in time, I would have memorized them very well. I would have recalled them a few times, and I know that I'm confident in retrieving the knowledge from my mind. So just before the exam or a few days before the exam, the notes that I'll be referring to would be this important set of notes, which I refer to as an error log. Okay? So, whichever concepts that you have difficulty recalling, if you were to review it enough times, then you will be able to recall it much more easily. Right? Whichever questions that you have difficulty answering, if you review it more often, and then you'll find that it becomes very easy for you to do. So to end off, let us review the routine that I usually do to prepare for an exam. As mentioned, there are two stages. In the first stage, I will make notes and I will memorize and recall. Okay, the more times you try to recall something that you've memorized, the easier it becomes. For stage number two, before I apply whatever that I've memorized to doing worksheets, what I'll do is I'll start off by recalling all the key concepts that I've learned in that chapter first before I practice the questions that are related to the chapter. And again, I don't do it just one time, I do it a few times. And trust me, you can be doing the same questions over and over again, but each time you will gain a deeper level of understanding. You may even gain new knowledge working on the same questions multiple times. Okay, so with that, I've shared the routine that I usually take when I'm revising for an exam. It may or may not work for you, but if you don't already have a routine, I would suggest that you put this into a test and see whether it works for you. Otherwise, I hope that there are other tips that can help you in your own methods as well.